Joseph could stand it no longer. There were many people in the room, and he said to his attendants, "Out, all of you." So he was alone with his brothers when he told them who he was. Then he broke down and wept. He wept so loudly the Egyptians could hear him, and word of it quickly carried to the Pharaoh's palace. "I am Joseph," he said to his brothers. "Is my father still alive?" But his brothers were speechless. They were stunned to realize that Joseph was standing there in front of them. "Please come closer," he said to them. So they came closer, and he said again, "I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into slavery in Egypt. But don't be upset and don't be angry with yourselves for selling me to this place. It was God who sent me here ahead of you to preserve your lives. This famine that has ravaged the land for 2 years will last 5 more years, and there will neither be plowing nor harvesting. God has sent me ahead of you to keep you and your families alive and to preserve many survivors. So it was God who sent me here, not you. And he is the one who has made me an advisor to Pharaoh, the manager of his entire palace and the governor of all Egypt. Now hurry back to my father and tell him, 'This is what your son Joseph says. God has made me master over all the land of Egypt, so come down to me immediately. You can live in the region of Goshen, where you can be near me with all your children and grandchildren, your flocks and herds, and everything you own. I will take care of you there, for there are still 5 years of famine ahead of us. Otherwise, you, your household, and your animals will starve.' Then Joseph added, 'Look, you can see for yourselves, and so can my brother Benjamin, that I really am Joseph. Go tell my father of my honored position here in Egypt. Describe for him everything you have seen, and then bring my father here quickly.' Weeping with joy, he embraced Benjamin, and Benjamin did the same. Then Joseph kissed each of his brothers and wept over them, and after they began talking freely with them. The news soon reached Pharaoh's palace. 'Joseph's brothers have arrived.' Pharaoh and his officials were all delighted to hear this. Pharaoh said to Joseph, 'Tell your brothers this is what you must do. Load your pack animals and hurry back to the land of Canaan. Then get your father and all your families and return here to me. I will give you the very best land in Egypt, and you will eat from the very best the land produces.' Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, 'Tell your brothers, take wagons from the land of Egypt to carry your little children and your wives, and bring your father here. Don't worry about your personal belongings, for the best of all the land of Egypt is yours.' So the son of Jacob did as they were told. Joseph provided them with wagons, as Pharaoh had commanded, and he gave them supplies for his journey. And he gave each of them new clothes, but to Benjamin he gave 5 changes of clothes and 300 pieces of silver. He also sent his father 10 male donkeys loaded with the finest products of Egypt, 10 female donkeys loaded with grain and bread and other supplies he would need on his journey. So Joseph sent his brothers off, and as they left, he called after them, 'Don't quarrel about this all along the way.' And he left Egypt and returned to their father, Jacob, in the land of Canaan. 'Joseph is still alive,' they told him, 'and he is governor of all the land of Egypt.' Jacob was stunned at the news. He couldn't believe it. But when they repeated to Jacob everything Joseph had told them, and when he saw the wagons Joseph had sent to carry him, their father's spirits revived. Then Jacob exclaimed, 'It must be true. My son Joseph is alive. I must go and see him before I die.'"
Amy. Appreciate it. If you are joining us for the first time this morning, you're jumping in at the end of a little series looking at the life of Joseph in the Old Testament book of Genesis. So well done. You have jumped in on the week when we'll kind of have the highlights compressed. That was good planning on your part. If you've been following along with us for the last several weeks, you won't be surprised that the story of Joseph has inspired people like Andrew Lloyd Webber to write musicals. It has inspired more commentaries than you would care to ever read. It has inspired thousands of wall feet of art. It has inspired thousands of years of speculation. And it stands fairly unique, almost peerless in ancient literature for the texture and the characterization. Critics of the mid-century Christian author C.S. Lewis say he was never any good at character development, at least not until one of his last books, Till We Have Faces. But you couldn't say the same thing about this story of Joseph. Think back with me. If you've been here for a few weeks, you'll remember that when we were first introduced to Judah, one of Joseph's older brothers, in the moment he invoked their brotherhood, he did so that he could make a buck on disposing of Joseph. And we saw in the chapter after that was chapter 37, we saw chapter 38, that he was really slow to be generous or loving towards his daughter-in-law Tamar, and quite the contrary. In fact, when she was in disguise and when he thought no one was looking, he was willing to use her like a disposable object for his own self-soothing. And yet, over the years, we saw that last week it was Judah who was begging to be a stand-in for Benjamin. It was Judah who was willing to pledge his life for another brother who could be lost. And it was Judah overlooking his father's scarring favoritism for years, who was willing and eager to spare his father further grief. Joseph, too, we've seen change, right? When we first met him, he was a tattletale, a likely liar. He was meant to be working for his brothers in chapter 37, and we saw really he wasn't working for them. He was parading around while they were wearing Carhartt coveralls, as it were. He was wearing this like spotless Gucci suit from Dad. Clearly never meant to get dusty or see sweat of a day's labor. And we saw him learn patience and obedience and integrity through years of suffering, such that last week we saw at this climax where he has them in his hand and under his power and is able to return tit for tat. Every point to avenge himself, he instead uses his power to rescue and comfort them. And we've seen Jacob aging. I think, from what I understand, this is the only place in all of ancient literature, maybe with the exception of the David story, where we see someone gradually enfeeble and then die. It's like each time the story checks in with Jacob, who's the father figure in all of this, he's a little bit older, and you can almost feel the weight, that you can almost sense the years that this grief has stolen from him. It's almost like you can see the kind of embrittling of his bones from suffering. So there's been tremendous character development, and then we get to last week where it seems like karma is about to give the ultimate payback. Joseph's brothers, who have done this dastardly thing to him and have been trying to hide it for all of these years now, karma, as it were, has brought it right back. And they have been found out. And Joseph now has gone from powerless to powerful, and he has them in his hands. And it's like it's almost inevitable, because we know hurt people hurt people. We looked at that several weeks ago. Generations of sin. And it's almost like we feel from the front side that it would be this beautiful moment of vindication, but we know from the back side it would just be an ongoing spiral of tragedy following tragedy. So the beautiful, unexpected surprise of last week and this week is in that moment when karma would have it all paid back. God surprises us with the gift of forgiveness. It's like this storyline that was spiraling in tragedy and trauma has at last sort of broken free in a tangent, and it's on the upswing. And yet, if you've been reading closely, you'll see even though the story has climaxed now and seems to be headed towards redemption and deliverance, beneath the surface there is still the spiraling. Take a look at this with me. Judah, the father, Remember the favoritism that we saw way back in chapter 37 was the sort of abrasion in the lives of his son into which the sepsis between them set. That's not gone. Chapter 42, verse 38, the brothers, 9 of them return from Egypt home. They're trying to get Jacob to let them return to Egypt with Benjamin in tow in order to get Simeon, who's held sort of as collateral there, out and to get new supplies. And Jacob says this to them in 42, verse 38, "My son will not go down with you. His brother Joseph is dead, and he is all I have left." If you've ever been overlooked by someone you stingingly love and admire, you can imagine how that hurt. The 9 other brothers standing in front of him as he says, "He is all I have left." Hearing the scope of their father's love so focused on Joseph and Benjamin as if they don't exist at all. Favoritism is still there. And Jacob seems to be a man who trusts money at least as much as he trusts God. Way back in chapter 32, which we didn't read, God had told him to get up from where he was and to go back to his homeland and back to his family of origin, and he was scared because he knew he was going to bump into his brother Esau, whom he had cheated. And God said, "It's going to be okay, I will treat you kindly." And Jacob said, "Okay, I'll go. And I'm going to send a bribe." And so he sends truckloads of gifts ahead of him to appease his brother Esau. I'll trust God, but I'm also going to trust money. And in a construction that's almost identical to that, when the brothers eventually convince Jacob to let them return to Egypt with Benjamin in tow, he says this, "Okay, but take a whole truckload of gifts and take double the money you found in your sacks." He's got one foot firmly on trusting God and one foot firmly on trusting what money can do to human hearts. Then there's Joseph. Right? For many people, Joseph is the paragon of virtue and integrity, and I tried to disrupt that a little for you the first week by suggesting that he was at very best, he was a tattletale on his brothers and lazy and parading and not very wise, sort of selfish and immature, maybe a liar. We saw over the years, though, he grew patient, he grew character, he was able to resist sexual temptation in a moment when he was terribly vulnerable. And yet, if we were to keep reading beyond this week, which we won't in chapter 45, if we get to 47, we would see that as he steers the nation of Egypt through this famine, he takes advantage of the hungry people. I think that you see this at the end of chapter 47, around 20, 21. Yes, Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh. All the Egyptians sold him their fields because the famine was so severe, and soon all the land belonged to Pharaoh. Guess who wears Pharaoh's signet ring? Joseph. As for the people, he made them all slaves from one end of Egypt to the other. He's grabbed all the land. All of the people have pledged themselves in a sort of indentured servitude without end, and every year they owe the crown 20% of what they produce from the land that is not theirs anymore. The narrator doesn't comment on this, doesn't say it's good or bad, but nor does he comment on Potiphar's wife's attempt to seduce Joseph, on Joseph's brother's decision to sell him into slavery. The narrator doesn't comment, and we are invited, I think, to read this in light of God's instructions to his people about the way they're meant to treat each other, about the way they're meant to treat the land, and and his instructions regarding slavery, and his instructions regarding kings, and his warnings about kings. And when we read it in that light, this looks to me an awful lot more like a despotic land grab than it does like a generous, wise leader steering his nation through crisis. Long ago, Joseph's fancy robe was taken from him, but it's been replaced with a robe of real Egyptian rank. I think, to him, this is a little bit like Gollum's ring. And then there's the brothers. Judah, foremost among the brothers, has showed this tremendous transformation. We've seen transformation in the other brothers. They seem to be contrite about what they've done to Joseph. But did you notice they never, ever come clean to Jacob? They've wronged Joseph, but they've also let their aged father live for decades, thinking that Joseph was dead and that they had nothing to do with it. In fact, they would rather just deceive him and keep on living with him deceived. And so much do they not trust that relationship that if you were to read all the way to chapter 50, you would see this. Once Jacob dies, the brothers are scared. Right? They've seen Joseph at that point. They've seen Joseph forgive them. They've seen Joseph welcome them into the land of Goshen. They've seen Joseph provide for their families out of the bounty of Egypt when they were on the fringe of starvation. And yet, when Jacob dies, the brothers get together and they think that Joseph is going to flip. They think Joseph has been play acting for Jacob all these years. And so they, who once lied to Jacob about Joseph, now lie to Joseph about Jacob. And they say, chapter 50, verses 16 and 17, before your daddy died, he instructed us to say to you, please forgive your brothers for the great wrong they did to you, for their sin in treating you so cruelly. These brothers who have been the recipients of such incredible forgiveness and grace, still, in chapter 50, are readier to trust deception than they are to trust the relationship. How you guys doing? I'm like, gee, thanks, Ian, for ruining the Joseph story for us. Here's why I did that. Because I think it's critical for us to see that although this story has broken free from the cycle of tragedy and trauma and seems to be on this upswing towards climax and towards redemption and towards restoration, in fact, beneath the surface, the very same human propensities that led to that whole chain of trauma is still active. Still there. Maybe muted a little, maybe. Still there. Which begs the question, where is God in all of this? If you're here the very first week, I said that question, where is God in the face of evil, is going to be a splinter in your mind in this series. Remember the first week, a stranger with no name in the middle of the desert who's able to tell Joseph where the brothers are. You remember a cupbearer who had this convenient blip of amnesia for 2 years. At so many stages through the story, we're invited to ask the question, where is God in the face of this suffering? And I told you, or at least I hope I told you, that I'm not going to provide you tidy, pat answers for that. I don't think the Bible provides us tidy, pat answers for that, but I do think it raises, if not answers to that question, then counterpoints. Observations that stand as counterpoints to the haunting question, where is God in the face of evil and suffering? And we've looked at some of these already. You remember in the week where we talked about sexual formation and the deepening of our desires, and we asked, where is God while Joseph is being seduced, and while Joseph is being mistreated, and while Joseph is forgotten in prison? And the answer the text gave us was God was with Joseph. Even though it doesn't seem like it, even though sometimes God seems to be absent or seems not to care or seems to be powerless, the Bible asserts over and over again that he is there. And so, when the psalmist says in Psalm 115, the nations say, "Where is their God?" And we answer, "Our God is in heaven. He does whatever pleases him." It's Matthew who has seen God come into the world, take on flesh expressly so that he can bleed. Matthew, surely remembering this, says, "Here is our God. He's with us." Emmanuel. One of the counterpoints the Bible gives and maintains through its entirety to the question, where is God in the face of evil and suffering, is he is there in the middle of it with his people. That same week, we also saw the reminder the narrator gave us again and again through those key words: remember, 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 forget, forget, forgot, remember. That when we find ourselves in situations where it feels like God is far off, or feels like he's absent, or feels like he's impotent, then our recourse is to remember him, which means a perspectival shift. It means to turn and to look for him, to turn in favor towards him. And it assures us that in the moment that we are doing that, that God is remembering us. When it feels like he's not there and you are crying out to him, his ear is bent towards you and his gaze is focused on you. Even when it doesn't feel like it. Remember God. He's remembering you. Last week when we looked at the story of wounds from those who are closest to us and the path to forgiveness, we saw that Jesus was the one who took on flesh so that he could bleed. And we were offered this answer to the question, where is God in the face of evil and suffering? Well, he's hanging on a cross, paying for our evil, suffering on a cross in order to forgive us that we might forgive. So consistently, the Bible is offering us these counterpoints to the question, where is God in all of this? They're not tidy answers. And this week in chapter 45, as we hit the climax, we are offered yet another answer. I wonder if you saw it. It's in verses 3 through 8. It's in 4 through 8 in Joseph's mouth. Here's the scene. Joseph has recognized his brothers for a long time. They don't yet recognize him. He's seen Judah's transformation, and Joseph has just identified himself to his brothers. As you can imagine, this is perhaps their nightmare, right? The most dastardly, presumptively thing they've ever done, that they tried their whole lives to cover over and forget, has been resurfaced. It's like those terrible old movies, I Know What You Did Last Summer, right? It's now back in their face, the tables have been turned, and their hearts are in their mouths, and Joseph steps forward. He says, I am your brother, Joseph, please come closer. They're shrinking in the background. He says, come closer, they come closer. He says again, I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into slavery in Egypt. Here it comes, they're terrified, but don't be upset. And don't be angry with yourselves for selling me to this place. It was God who sent me here ahead of you to preserve your lives. You sold me into slavery. God sent me here to preserve your lives. Joseph's not just confusing his subjects. He goes on to say virtually the same thing 2 more times in this paragraph. Famine has ravaged the land for 2 whole years. The last 5 more years, there's neither plowing nor harvesting. God has sent me ahead of you to keep you and your families alive and preserve many survivors. So it was God who sent me here, not you. And then a twist on it, and it is he who made me an advisor, literally a father to Pharaoh. Well, which is it? Did Joseph's brothers sell him into slavery, or did God send him there? And this is another answer the Bible gives us to the question, where is God in the face of evil and suffering? The Joseph story is perhaps the most beautiful, drawn-out exploration of this profound mystery. And it asserts that even in the face of terrible, terrible things, God is in control. And this is not just the story of Joseph. This is the through arc of the entire Bible. It maintains again and again, God is in control, utterly in control. He's not ignorant, he's not absent, he's not impotent. He's not golfing during earthquakes. He's not asleep during genocides. He's not wringing powerless hands during hate crimes. God is in control. That's what the Bible asserts again and again, and yet we make real choices that have real consequences. Humans are really truly responsible for the things that we do. You're like, I don't get that. Well, I don't either. It's hard for my little brain to hold these things together. God is fully in control, and yet we have responsibility. We make real decisions that really impact things and other people and ourselves. And we are responsible for them. And God's in control. And the Bible does not, in a philosophical way, try to tidy this up for us. It doesn't unpack how it is that these two things are. It just maintains that they are. An answer to the question, is God in control, or do humans have responsibility for their choices in lives? The Bible says yes. And I think, even in our post-Christian moment, for many here who don't yet believe in Jesus, and perhaps for many of us who do believe in Jesus, but who haven't yet let it fully shape our thinking, we still lurch back and forth between these two perspectives because it's hard to hold them together. Think about dating and jobs. Two of the things that are most shaping in our lives, and two of the things that for most of us are the hardest to control. How often do you hear pre-Christians, non-Christians, Christians, people who believe in the flying spaghetti monster, atheists say, if it's meant to be, it'll be. If it's meant to happen, it'll happen. As if we're all just sort of these pawns on a chessboard, and some sort of the universe is somehow just moving us around on the chessboard, and we have no say and no consequence. We are just pawns. Whether you don't have to be an atheist to believe that. You don't have to be a Christian to believe that. A lot of us lapse into this sort of mindset, that we're just pawns. Stop and think about how grim that is. If we're just pawns being moved around on a chessboard, then what is Jill's love for me? On the flip side, though, at least as depressingly, we often lapse into the mindset that we have ultimate agency. That there's no agency higher than ours, there's no agency equal with ours, and so at the end of the day, we make our choices, and we are left alone in the universe to deal with the consequences of our choices and other people's choices. And that sounds so grim. And the Bible maintains here through the Joseph story that it's not one or the other. That when you sold me into slavery, God was sending me here to rescue you. It's both. Lord Radstock was at a hotel in Norway back in the the mid-19th century, and he was upstairs and he heard a piano downstairs being played, and it was being played artlessly. It was a kid. He could tell by the way the keys were being murdered, by the way the music was being butchered. It was just offensive. And he was probably didn't have kids. He was on his way downstairs to sort this out when he saw a gentleman come and sit next to this little girl and start filling in around her notes and start riffing on these discordant notes that she played in a way that was beautiful, and the music that resulted was glorious. He took her artless, murderous notes and made them beautiful. Lord Radstock didn't realize that the man who sat down next to that little girl was her father, and his name was Alexander Borodin, and he was a composer. To me, this doctrine of God's sovereignty in the midst of suffering is tremendously comforting. It does not mean that the things we do don't matter. It does not mean that the terrible things that others have done to you do not matter. Do not hear me saying that. But it does mean that while Joseph's brothers were doing the cruelest thing they could think of, there was a wiser power, a wiser mind, a deeper power at play. There was an omnipotent God at the helm in that moment. It's like God is this divine alchemist who's able to spin out of our greed. He's able to make something glorious. And out of our hubris, he's able to bring hope. And out of the wreckage, he's able to bring redemption. He is that wise and kind. Jim Packer, some of you will know, theologian, in his book, Knowing God, he has this illustration of York train station. He says if you were to go to York station and stand between the platforms for 40 minutes or so, he'd say you would see the trains coming and going, and you'd get an idea of the types of trains that came into that station, but you would not know much about the train schedule or the bigger picture unless, in his inimitable way, he says, unless one of the higher-ups were to take you into the control booth in between platforms 4 and 5, which is, I guess, Harry Potter land, and you go in between, or you go into that control booth, and there you could see on one entire wall this map of the railway lines extending for 5 or 6 miles in all different directions, and you would see the little blinking lights moving along those maps that were meant to represent the trains, and you could hear the conversation of the conductors, and you could see the master schedule on the wall. And he says, when you see those things in the control booth, you start to understand why it is that one train arrives when it does and from where it does. And Packer goes on to say, that sort of perspective is what we Christians long for. We all hope that we can get inside God's mind and see the way he is orchestrating all of the vagaries of life, and we think that by drawing into deeper relationship with him, we will. But some of you know Packer's story. When he was a kid, he was hit by a truck. I think it was 7 years old, if I recall correctly, hit by a bread delivery van. His skull was crushed, and he had to have a metal plate put into his skull. And he was an active boy, and for his birthday, he wanted a bicycle just like all of his friends were getting for theirs. But his parents were sensible. This was the days before bicycle helmets. This kid had a plate in his head, and they realized he was still too fragile. Instead, they gave him a typewriter. And if you read biographies of Packer, the biographers make a big deal out of this accident, out of his fragility, out of his parents' decision to give him a typewriter, and they say that this led him on a course indoors towards bookishness that resulted in a man who has written books that have blessed millions of people. And it's like they almost invite us to say God was steering that bread truck. But if you were to ask Packer, he would tell you exactly what he does after sharing that illustration of the train station. He'd say, Christian wisdom does not begin with going inside that control tower and seeing the bigger picture. It doesn't. Christian wisdom begins with recognizing just how limited our perspective is. It comes with realizing that we don't have access to the bigger picture. Christian wisdom begins with this deepening respect for the God who does see the bigger picture. Christian wisdom begins with a deeper dependence on the one who is able to see the bigger picture. Christian wisdom comes with a deeper admiration for the one who is able to see and to control what we cannot see and what we cannot control. And Christian wisdom begins with a deeper respect for this God and a deeper love and a closer following of him because he does what we cannot do. He has access to what we will never have in this life. So where does this leave us? Does it mean that we don't ever talk about God's sovereignty? No, we do. God's sovereignty is like this giant steel I-beam. And when we use it with each other, when we slide it up underneath each other in moments of need, is incredibly comforting. It's solid footing. But it's also a giant steel I-beam that you can really wound people with. And so you notice when Joseph tells his brothers about God's sovereignty and he assures them of God's sovereignty, it is applied to men who have for years been carrying shame and guilt and remorse about the thing they've done. And he slides up under them this I-beam of God's sovereignty saying, even though you sold me into slavery, God had a bigger plan. Some of you, you can talk to me afterwards for a minute, okay? And I can share it with other people if it's appropriate. Thanks. And if God, in that moment, if God, if we slide it up underneath each other to comfort each other, but the way we often hear the sovereignty of God being applied is different. It's when somebody has just lost or somebody has just been wounded, we tell each other, well, God's in control. That's not the way the Bible is using it here. That's not the way Joseph is using it to reassure his brothers that even in the moment of their deepest, grimmest sin, a sovereign and kind God was at work. I don't know if you've noticed in this Joseph story, all along the way, there has been a picture frame. A picture frame that is made out of it's one phrase, more or less, that gets repeated over and over again. First time we see this phrase is right at the beginning of the story, back in chapter 37. Remember, if you were here that first week, that's the week that Joseph's brothers betray him, they sell him out, and they go back to his dad, Jacob. You can look up all of these references on your own if you want. We're not going to go through them all. And they go back to the dad, Jacob, and they tell him he's been ravaged by an animal and he's probably dead. And Jacob, in chapter 37, verse 35, says, I will go to my grave in grief. This old, frail man. 2 more times. If the brothers return from Egypt to try to convince the dad to let them go back to Egypt to get Simeon out and get more supplies and take Benjamin, 2 more times he says to them, you are going to bring this gray head down to its grave in grief for my son. And we know in our chapter this week, chapter 45, that we have hit the climax of the story because that phrase flips around. I don't know if you saw it in chapter 45, verse 28, right at the end of this story this week. This is what happens. The brothers tell Jacob that Joseph is alive, and he finally is convinced. He finally comes out of this like stupor, and he says, it must be true. My son Joseph is alive. I must go and see him before I die. It's been flipped on its head. And if we were to keep reading, we would see that in the next chapter, this old man is struggling, presumably torn about going now to Egypt where his son is, but leaving the home that God has promised will be an inheritance for his family for all time. And God appears to him in a dream in chapter 46 and says, it's okay. It's okay. Get up. Go to Egypt. You will die there. But your son Joseph will be there to shut your eyes. And we see at the end of chapter 45, our chapter this week, one of the most beautifully understated, actually chapter 46, verses 29 through 30, one of the most beautifully understated passages in the Bible. When they finally see each other, Jacob and Joseph run towards each other. I think we've got the text, and it says, Joseph embraced Jacob and held him for a long time, and they wept. And Jacob says to Joseph, I can now go to my grave because I have seen my son alive. Do you see it? Do you see the picture frame that is around this story? We're not given privileged access to see the control room behind the vagaries of all life's events, but nor are we left entirely in the dark. There is a frame on this story, and the frame of this story is a father's love for his kid. It's a dad who is willing to sacrifice everything, leave everything, give up everything, risk everything in his frailty, in aged life to go embrace his son and receive him back from the dead. That's the frame on this story that helps us to understand what's going on. And you say to me, but Jacob's a rotten guy. Yeah, he is. In many ways. Fiercely loving, but a rotten guy. Which is why I misled you in saying that this is the frame. This is more like the matting. This is the cheap, colored nest into which the picture of the life of Joseph is laid. But it is all surrounded by a much larger, exquisite frame of the perfect love of a perfect father for his son. And it's that love, it's that frame that shapes our understanding of God's presence in the midst of suffering and evil. Because we're reminded that years